Welcome back, everybody, to our 14th lesson on the laws of Shabbat, B'nei Halacha. And now we're going to get down to the more basic laws of Shabbat. Until now, we were really focusing on the spiritual meaning behind Shabbat. And we spoke about how the week and the Shabbat are connected, and that the weekday is sort of like relates to the physical, material body of a person, and Shabbat is the soul of a person. And when they're both in harmony, so one is going to nourish the other one. We spoke about this in many different aspects. And in other words, each one will allow the other one to express itself. And this topic of today, we're going to be talking about preparing the needs of Shabbat. And this begins really during the week. And when we do that, we are uplifting the week, exalting the week, and lifting it up. And therefore, in this way, we are considered making a complete unison. We're making shalom, peace between the week and during Shabbat. Really, this is really our focus, that even during the week we want to uplift the Shabbat. And in the Talmud, in the tractate of Beitzah is one of the different tractates of the Talmud, which talks about the laws of Yom Tov and Muktzah, basically, and on some other topics as well. And there's a story about Shammai HaZaken. Shammai HaZaken, he was one of the we call them the period of the Zugot. We know that after the Second Temple was rebuilt, during the times of Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, during that time when the temple was restored, and it lasted 420 years. And after the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, the Great Assembly, which really ended with Shimon HaTzadik, which is really in the times of the Greek rule at that time. It was sort of parallel to the reign of the Greeks, Macedonia. At that time, when the Anshe Knesset Gdolah, the Great Assembly, which was comprised of 120 different great rabbis and scholars, which began with even prophets, it was moved in a period of time in the oral law teachings, because this is very, very, it's a basic principle. It's called the Zugot. In other words, our oral law, which really took a tremendous boost during the period of Ezra HaSofer, during the period of the Second Temple, with the leadership of Ezra, we see tremendous changes. In other words, the development of a huge, huge amount of different laws that developed afterwards, and enactments, different decrees by the great rabbis, and this was all to uplift the nation. And we see different periods of time which is important to relate to, and one of them is called the Zugot. After the Great Assembly, again, which comprised of 120 members I mentioned, there came a period called the Zugot. The Zugot, one of them was the prince, called the Nasi. He was a prince of the court, and the other one was the Av Beitin, like the father of the court. They worked together as these two important figures and leaders of Israel. And one of the Zugot was Hillel HaZaken and Shammai HaZaken. Hillel and Shammai are all very famous, because from each one of them, from Hillel, came Beit Hillel, the house of Hillel, a whole direction of philosophy, and also from Shammai the same way. And the elder, Shammai the elder, the Talmud tells us in the tractate of Beitzah that, and again, his time, he lived, if you're familiar with Jewish history, he lived during the time of King Herod, and his inheritors, which were his different sons, inherited him. And during that time period of King Herod, which again was, if you're familiar with the Roman emperors at that time, we're talking about at the time where King Herod himself knew Mark Antony and Julius Caesar, and right after that, again, Augustus comes into power. Octavian was known as Augustus. The emperor comes into power. So that's really the time of, or the second emperor Tiberius, during that time period was very parallel to what we're talking about now, about the Zugot period. Shammai HaZaken and Hillel HaZaken. And during that time, Shammai HaZaken, he had a custom. And his custom was that he would always save the best for Shabbat. In other words, if he would go to the market and he would see something, let's say he would buy something and he liked it a lot and he saved it for Shabbat, like a nice, beautiful fruit or whatever it was, an animal, that he wanted to have this piece of meat for Shabbat. So if he saw, that was a nice piece of meat or a nice a piece of fruit or whatever it was, he said, I'm going to put this away for Shabbat. And then if he go back to the market and he saw something the next day better, he would take the next item. He'd always save the best for Shabbat. Every time, if he sees something nicer than what he first got, he would choose that. And that's how he would honor the Shabbat. And that was called the way of Shammai Zaken. Hillel Zaken, on the other hand, who was his partner, as I mentioned, in the court, he would honor every single day. In other words, he would say when he would, there's a verse in Psalms 68 that says, God blesses each and every day. In other words, in every day what he found in the market, he would eat. He said, God is going to provide for me for Shabbat, for sure. In other words, he looked at each and every day as what he had was the blessing for that day, and that for surely, for Shabbat, the nicest thing in the world is going to come into his hands for Shabbat, and he knows that for sure that his needs will be taken care of. So these are two different ways of looking at it. So the question is asked, what should we do today? Should we go by Hillel HaZaken and say every day, don't worry about it, we'll eat whatever we want, and Shabbat we'll have good food? Or should we go by the way of Shammai HaZaken, that we see something, the best, put away for Shabbat? And in reality, and this is really what our rabbis teach us, is that for sure we should go by Shammai HaZaken. In other words, the level that Hillel was on, he did not expect people to be on that level himself. He even wouldn't recommend it to his students to be on that level, that everything you see, you know for sure, God is going to provide for you, so you have no problem. How many people are on that level that are saying, they're living for the day, knowing tomorrow God's going to provide for you something even better? That's really the level of faith of those who ate the manna, the generation, that every day the man came down from the heavens and we relied on that. So in other words, this was a level not for the layman, for the simple person. But in reality, we should go by Beit Shammai. If we see something really good, let's save it for Shabbat. Because we may not get a good one, like we may not have another chance to get something like this. And that's really the law. So if we have something very special and you know it's not going to be around, get it for Shabbat and save it for Shabbat. Today, you can ask a question regarding today. Our supermarkets are full to the top and everything we need is really there. So in reality, if we really want to, we don't really have that problem so much of not really getting something. It can happen, but it's rare. But when we go buying for Shabbat, our food, we should always say, for sure, the best food you purchase, like the most expensive food, that for surely you should save for Shabbat. And in other words, we should also make sure that when we go buy and we purchase our food, we always say that this I'm buying for the Sabbath. In other words, by saying when you go shopping, usually you do your preparations on Thursday, whatever you go, you're doing your shopping for Shabbat, always have in mind and say in the store, I'm buying this for the honor of Shabbat, to sanctify the Sabbath with this food. And that's an important thing. One other thing we'll mention in this lesson is, before Shabbat, a lot of times if you go into a house, and you're cooking for Shabbat, and wow, I'm blessed with an amazing wife that puts out a spread that everyone who comes to Shabbat to my house wants to come back again. And Leah is an amazing cook. And it's really, it's important. It's brought down in Jewish law that you should taste. Before Shabbat comes in, it's good to taste the food. Make sure it's tasting well. Maybe you have to add another, what's it called? A little spice to it. So you have to make sure it tastes good. So taste it before Shabbat. And, there are stories of rabbis that would just go crazy tasting the food and they would finish it off completely. But anyway, sometimes I have a problem with that when it comes to Lay's kugel, a potato kugel. You have one piece, you want to have another one. But anyway, that's a nice custom. So on Friday, when you're in the house, has an amazing smell and aroma to it of Shabbat cooking. You can go and taste the soup, taste the cholent, taste your kugel, or whatever you're planning on cooking, on serving on Shabbat. And of course, it makes it, it brings the atmosphere of a beautiful Shabbat in, knowing that you're already connecting to the amazing delicatessen, delicatessen, what do you call it? Deluxe food that we serve on Shabbat. But anyway, this was our 14th lesson, and God willing, we'll continue soon with our 15th lesson. Bye-bye.